This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Wendyliz Martinez, a 2024 ACLS Leading Edge Fellow, where she works with the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, developing a digital humanities project related to the history of slavery within the state of New Jersey. She earned her doctorate in English and African American Studies at Penn State University and is the City College of New York and Mellon Mays Undergraduate Fellow alumna. She is currently writing about Black girlhood and its depictions in social media, film, and literature, and maintains an interest in art practices from Black communities and its impact on our understanding of Blackness, as well as its role in preserving histories. Hello, Wendyliz. How are you today?
I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm fantastic. I'm really happy that we had time to, we're able to arrange a time to talk today and get your perspectives on the field of Black studies. We'll get into, questions about it in a bit, but the kind of work you do and the kind of resources you're using in your work and the kind of way you open up, I think, so many new dimensions and horizons of Black studies with your interests, I just think it's really important to get your perspective, not just as a graduate student, but somebody really working on the edges, the new horizons of Black studies. So I'm really excited to have time to talk to you. Also, we share, as I mentioned when we were chatting beforehand, the English and Black studies double relationship. So I'm very curious to hear about that as we go along.
Awesome. Yes. Thank you for having me. And I'm excited for the conversation to follow.
Excellent. Let me start before we talk about your own work and the, how you think about it in relation to the field of Black studies. I wanted to start with maybe a more personal question and invite you to narrate your way into the field of Black studies. What is it that drew you to the field? What drew you to the study of Black life? And then also along with that, what sustained your interests as a teacher and scholar?
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks again, and I'm looking forward to the conversation that will arise. But to kind of begin with that, my interest in Black studies, I think it's important for me to kind of foreground that I went to Catholic school from primary through high school. And even though I went to Catholic school in the Bronx, where the majority of students were students of color, our curriculum and our teachers were often not reflective of the student population. So we didn't really get a lot of lessons or even see teachers that kind of look like us along the way. So when I actually started my bachelor's at City College, that kind of changed for me a bit. And there it was, I had to pick one of the required courses, and it was like one of those worldview courses, and they had listed an introduction to Black studies course, which was introduction to the Afro-Caribbean, something like that. And within the description, it included the Dominican Republic, which automatically drew me since that is where my family is from. So I was really interested in okay, I never saw my culture engaged with on a level, on a collegiate level, or even in a lesson plan prior to this. So I was really interested in seeing what that class was going to be made of. So I took the course, and from there kind of just was the catalyst for me to being okay, I think I want to be a Black studies major. But I still found myself kind of connected to my English classes as well. So I decided to do the double major, which I was allowed to do at City. And from there, I kind of became really interested in the ways that Black Studies offered me a way to, interact with my personal history, but also think about the ways that people have been challenging anti-Blackness historically and in creative ways. Histories that I never got a chance to engage with beyond like maybe a question that I had to answer for the Regents. And so at City, that was kind of the catalyst. And then at during my later time, like maybe my junior year of my bachelor's, I took it was like a labor and resistance African American studies course. And the professor there, Dr. Venus Green, who is retired, she advertised that they were taking applications for the Melamese undergraduate fellowship.
It's a great program. Yeah.
Yes, it really is. And it's really been pivotal for me in my relationship with academia and Black studies in general. But at the time, I wasn't sure if I should apply, but she encouraged me, and other professors also gave me like little pushes here and there. So I applied and I ended up getting accepted. And I think that program really also kind of changed the course of how I interacted with questions and just scholarship in general. At that time, I was really interested in like narratives, and I try to take my my own take on like the Harlem Renaissance or like a post Harlem Renaissance writing. I'm not really doing that now. My interests have diverted so significantly, but that's kind of where I started. And I think in part because eventually I got to work with Dr. Vanessa K. Valdez, who was in the Department of like Spanish, French, and Portuguese department. And so she became my Melamese mentor. And she really kind of even more so opened the possibility of like, oh wow, I can really do a number of things with Black studies. Like I don't have to focus on one specific region or this type of specific literature. Or it didn't feel rigid, and she kind of opened that door for me as far as like you can do Caribbean literature, even though I think I knew that, but I didn't have that opportunity to do it quite yet. So under her, like I started engaging with literature by Black women writers from Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic, and thought about queer theory and Afrofuturism in ways that, I wouldn't have had the opportunity if I didn't participate in the program. And after that, I kind of took a break, I'll put that in quotes because I did the New York City Teaching Fellows. So I actually, during my break, I got a master's in education. And then
yeah,
also,
that's I think not always what people mean by break.
Right,
Got a master's.
Right, exactly. But for some reason, it was a break for me, I guess, in that I didn't immediately pursue the PhD after, because Melamate kind of pushes you to apply for PhD programs or prepares you for that trajectory. So I was like, I'll take a little bit of a detour here. And that experience also kind of strengthens my relationship with Black studies. I saw, again, the same kind of narrative of students of color. I worked at a public high school not too far from where I grew up. And a lot of the students there were like, Miss, I really would like to see, more lessons about us, about our history, like, or I would include these things in my own lesson plans, and they would be really like, oh, I didn't know that this was true, or I didn't know we can learn about this. Like, we even, I tried to break down, like, okay, Solange's album had just come out, so we had all sat around and talked about, like, okay, what does this mean? How do we break down music? Like, all of these things are are possible. Like they're not just things that aren't significant or aren't important to our intellectual development. And so again, I felt myself being pulled back into academia, and I applied to a few programs and ended up in the dual title at Penn State, which mirrors my undergraduate kind of trajectory as well. So I am dual title Black Studies and English again. And since I've been here, it's been transformative, to say the least. I've been engaging way more with different centuries than I have in the past, as far as like 19th century writers, being introduced to like thinkers and theorists like Anna Julia Cooper, or working with the Black Women's Organizing Archive, and in general getting the opportunity to work with the Center for Black Digital Research has been transformative in that way of like rethinking how do we kind of bring scholarship that's have been going on, and how do we bring that to the digital world? How do we continue to expand those scholars and scholarship and the things that's going on there? And yeah, now I find myself thinking more about art and Black studies, and we'll see where that goes. I'm still in the preliminary stages of thinking about, because I've been interacting with that center, just technology in general. So not just the technology that we interact with now, like, you know, our phones, our computers, the softwares, but also through my own personal relationship with photography, like the invention of the camera and photographs. How has that impacted our understanding of Blackness and its development? And so I look forward to engaging with Black studies through there also in the future.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, this is one of my favorite questions to hear people talk about in this podcast, because of the wildly different journeys that people have into a concern with Black life and with Black studies. And, you know, it's just so interesting to hear you talk. And, you know, I mean, today, you know, for if I'll date the podcast this way, be a few weeks before it's out, but this is the first day of classes where I teach, right? And I think for a lot of universities, but it's like this reminder that what we do is not just a grind. It's not just grading. It's not just preparation of lectures. Like the level of impact can be so deeply existential just by, you know, there's the content, but I mean, I heard a lot in what you were saying. It's just by the very presence of the kinds of things we do, you know, because you said with that intro to Black studies that it wasn't just like the content of the Black studies class changed you, but it was like the fact that there is a thing, Black studies, and that the Caribbean could be a part of it.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely.
And wonderful that you know, but after your bachelor's, you know, going back in some ways to correct what you had as a K through 12 student, you know, and taking the very best of Black studies, which is the world is an archive. Here's an album. How does it help us think?
Exactly.
I love that. And it makes me think about the origins of the field of Black studies. And this is a second question that I wanted to ask you, because, you know, already what you've talked about in terms of your own path is about the transformative existential and political dimension of Black studies, but also how it expands a sense of an intellectual tradition. You know, when you said that about going to Catholic school, I went to a Catholic university. It was the same thing. We didn't even talk about the United States. We only talked about Europe.
Right.
And so the way there's a corrective to come, right? Whatever great things come from that kind of intensely Eurocentric education. So that transformation of curriculum, right? In some ways, you've already articulated this origin of the field, right? Which, you know, at San Francisco State and across the country was driven really by two imperatives. One was the struggle for Black liberation and the imperative for a different kind of political relationship, both inside the university and in the relationship between the university and community. But also that second imperative was very much like, look, English departments, history departments, et cetera, don't give anything like a sufficient treatment of Black life. So Black Studies has to come in and do that intellectual work to witness the tradition, to develop it, to deepen it, to expand it. But again, that first imperative was a political imperative, right? That Black Studies is different in that it has a different kind of relationship to community politics and Black liberation struggle that's material. So when it's 2024 and you've done your doctoral work over, the last, handful plus years, I'm curious how, looking back, how you imagine the field today in relation to that origin.
Yeah. I think it's been, I feel there's a delicate balance that I think Black Studies occupies of again, like how you mentioned, the corrective kind of component of it, where we're trying to course correct our just academia in at large, as far as like what is considered significant, important to study, who are knowledge producers, what is significant enough to study, alongside like that political engagement with liberation, or just in general like that community involvement that goes like outside of the university. So how do departments perhaps maybe even engage with the community? And I think now, and I think this is more so probably issue with academia maybe, but I think we're still at that stage where there is we still need to work out that balance between like engaging with the public and making sure that our work is not like exploitative or harmful in the sense of like we're studying Black life, we're studying these people, these events, these circumstances, but then we don't directly engage with the folks that are at the center of our scholarship, or maybe not including them. But I do think there are, Black Studies has grown so much in the past, and since its creation, I think now we have so many subcategories that are, always challenging that, making sure that we are, even thinking about ethics of care when it comes to, how we engage with scholarship. I think, it's been so expansive. I'm thinking about one of the final classes I audited, which was actually an undergraduate course at Penn State, but I really wanted to take it because it was Black digital studies, which is interesting because I feel like even if you switch around that wording, like digital Black studies, it would be a different course than Black digital studies. But there we kind of we revisited Manny Marble's Black Studies and the Racial Mountain. And so we kind of talked about like, okay, the three kind of components of Black Studies. It's prescriptive, corrective, and oh wow, I can't believe I forgot. Descriptive. Yes, descriptive is yeah. I'm like, no, I'm gonna let down so many people.
This big dispute with Henry Louis Gates.
Right.
Really interesting.
Right. But yeah, so thinking about even that kind of like those components and Black Studies, I think has even developed in really fascinating ways over the past 50 years, and maybe even I feel like maybe the past 10, 15 years, especially with, developments in technology. I think that's really pushed Black Studies like in I don't want to say different direction, but in definitely a direction where we're considering a lot of things, and even how we re-engage with the works. I'm thinking about the center again. Like, even though there's scholarship from the 19th century we're engaging with, we're still engaging with digital technologies up to date of how do we make that information accessible online? How do we map, digital humanities and such? So, yeah.
Yeah, it's so interesting. It's funny you bring up Marable because it's Marable's, work on that, exactly that, about the prescriptive and the descriptive and the corrective. That's really behind that question. And sort of how does it register today is really interesting. And as you say, part of the institutionalization of Black studies, which is inevitable if it's going to be successful. It has to be an institution. People can't be fighting for their very existence every semester.
Right.
But a new challenge comes with that, as you said, like how do we have an ethic of care in relation to the communities we study, right? Whether we're humanists or social scientists. And I think that's a question, and I love the way you put that. It's like these are some of the most animating questions of the field today, but they weren't really an animating question at the beginning because of just that. First of all, I think that sense of intimacy. I mean, they're just the struggling for your existence makes a different relationship,
Right.
but also one that I think it's taken a long time to talk very closely about. I will give like your generation and the immediate preceding a lot of credit for pushing everybody on these questions.
Mhm.
So let me ask you about your particular work. You've talked about it. It's it's really a mix of literary studies, media studies, digital methods, and also digital objects. Which for me has, it's a field I follow. I don't write in it, but I follow it pretty closely. I think it's generated some incredibly interesting new insights for Black studies. So I'm curious, as someone who works in this field, how you think about your own work in relation to the past of Black studies. How do you situate it in relation to that past? But also, what new horizons do you see it opening up?
Right. So I think part of my work, like as I've mentioned, even personally, like my latest work, which is my dissertation, I think one of the ways that my work relates, and I feel like this is just a theme perhaps, but it just, again, and probably an unfortunate theme, but it highlights how a lot of the kind of struggles we've been um speaking about or bringing up still continue. So I'm thinking about Anna Julia Cooper talking about when I enter, the race enters with me, and this idea of like her being a woman and being Black, and she's not the only speaker that's ever mentioned this before. There are other women, Black women of her time, who have brought up this issue of, and then we have Kimberly Crenshaw, who coins the term intersectionality to give us another term to grapple with this phenomenon that's been happening already. And still, I feel like we're seeing that conversation now, which my dissertation kind of gets into a little bit with this idea of Black girls online. And even though I go back to the 90s, which isn't that far ago, but I mean, now it feels like forever
Increasingly
ago.
it is. That's what's
Yeah.
it's further
Yeah.
back than I sometimes admit, but yeah.
Right. But even as recent, or however you want to call it, there's Black girls still kind of echoing those kind of laments in a way, like we're girls, we're experiencing the world a different way than is usually recognized, and these are the ways that we interact with in the world, to give us sort of agency, or to take back our autonomy. And yeah, so I see myself kind of engaging with the longer trajectory of Black studies in that way, of just highlighting again I don't know. I know recently there's like discourse on like resistance and like everything is resistance now. But I do think there's levels to that. So I guess engaging with I don't think necessarily outright resistant movements, because I don't want to think about the girls in my dissertation as necessarily just agents of resistance, but on some level, yes, talking about resistance and talking about how do we even conceive of our positionality, see myself engaging with Black studies in that way, but then how do I see its future, I think is, again, it feels kind of redundant, but with the technologies itself. So I'm talking about film. I do include novels, but I also talk about social media like TikTok, and how we see that mimicking, again, sort of the same old, same old. You see appropriation there, and just that Black girls being trendsetters, but again, not being given the credibility of that. And so thinking about I feel like, again, it's really difficult because there is that delicate balance between, like, Combahee River Collective thinking about the personal is political, but also there's so much more than the political also, and thinking about our impact on the world beyond that.
I mean, even, as you said, this trend setting and then appropriation. I mean, these become political moments, but the antechamber to that is like the space of creation.
Right.
I mean, exactly. It's before, right? It's in some ways, I mean, for me, sorry, I mean, I'm inserting myself here, but like when I think about exactly what you're describing, I think about the importance of this notion of refusal. It's just sometimes things are happening outside the interracial space of exploitation, appropriation, violence, and resistance and revolution, and how to find a language for that. I think, as you were saying, that's Anna Julia Cooper. Like, what is Black womanhood? Both in that entry, entering the room and race enters with me, but also the fact that you were outside the room, right? Exactly, and what was going on there. And these become evergreen themes, but I think the digital is really interesting because of the, as you were saying, it has like a different sense of time almost. Like it's happening so quickly and we're witnessing it happening quickly. We're not witnessing it going through a whole process and then it appears.
Right. And it almost feels like fast forwarded in the digital sphere, like 2015. I mean, it was 10 years ago. That doesn't feel that long ago, but in the sphere of the digital, like that's ages ago. Like that, it feels like, even trends like now, like they have a half-life, like you're done with that trend and like next week there's a new one. And I think, as you mentioned, like that temporality is really important for how the Black diaspora engages with the digital. And I actually it makes me think about some scholars that are engaging with digital and media studies, like Andre Brock Jr.'s Distributed Blackness, like how he challenges that notion of like resistance as being like the underpin of like reasons why we're doing what we do online, like and that's been interesting to me to think about, like just like how you mentioned also like that refusal, like just challenging these already notions that maybe what's the word I want to use, kind of like what we gravitate to, and then let's reframe that and maybe think about it a little bit more.
I mean, just to use a literary example, I mean, one of the most interesting disputes for me in the African American intellectual tradition is Richard Wright making literature sociological and Ralph Ellison saying,
we can just be literary and experimental, and what to do in that crossroads, the way we never move from that. It's one of the few things where I say the persistence of this over time is actually a great thing. I think it's really interesting. Usually, like, we're still addressing the same issues as like a case for nihilism, but I actually think this is where the politics and culture relationship is so fascinating. Yeah.
Right.
And sort of thinking about that, as you're talking about your own work and your interests, one of the things that really drew me to your profile, and why I was excited that you made time for the podcast, was that you do work in an area of studies, African American studies or Black studies, but also a discipline, English. And so I'm curious to hear you talk about how you think that relationship, which I've learned in your introductory remarks, it actually goes all the way back to college. But how that relationship between African American studies and English, between a discipline and an area study, how you think that has impacted your intellectual journey, formed it in certain ways, whether it's tensions or productive relationships, but also your teaching?
I haven't thought about the teaching part that much, but I can start with, I think it's been an interesting relationship, as you mentioned, like an area studies and a discipline. I think I've spent my time always trying to like push back on like the ideas of discipline, like these are our methodologies, and just like I've been attracted to this idea of like the undisciplined scholar, or like versus like interdisciplinary. I'm still thinking through that. So I do view myself as an interdisciplinary scholar because I think Black study does that for me, where it's like a very interdisciplinary field in itself, although every department has almost its own strengths. So every department of Black studies is not going to be the same. So that's also been interesting to navigate as a new scholar, young scholar, is like interacting with that level of like, okay, this is just what academia is in a sense. But I think I've been able to kind of balance that pool of like thinking about my discipline in English and Black studies, and just giving myself permission to break the rules a little bit. Especially, I think to like I mentioned earlier, my mentor, Vanessa K. Valdez, like she really was like a catalyst for that, because she's like she just gave it, she was just straight up with me when I was in undergrad. She was just like, you got to do what you got to do, and then you can do what interests you about this. And right now, she's doing incredible work in the field, even though her like department at City was like the romance languages department. But still her work is it can be Black studies as well, and that's been kind of a model for me as far as like thinking about and I know we kind of touched upon that, or that's part of the question, is this idea of like it's its own field with methods and theories that come from Black studies, of course, but at the same time it is that space where we can challenge that. I feel like that's part of the beauty of Black studies, is like also you can challenge this institutionalization of it in that way.
And I think English departments, absolutely. I mean, I think the English departments are interesting for pairing with Black studies. I mean, obviously I find it interesting because that's my relationship and yours as well. But I mean, in so many cases, English departments are almost area studies. I mean, the way they house people working on film and art, and the way history texts and methods are actually often a part of how you do English research. But But Black Studies takes that next step and pushes it. I mean, a term I find increasingly interesting to think about as anti-disciplinary. Like maybe it's a little bit of warfare going on, right? I think of myself more multidisciplinary, but I'm really intrigued by the anti-disciplinary, and as a self-challenge, maybe I need to be more revolutionary, you know, within the confines of, you know, really ivory walls, but nevertheless. And I think it will be really interesting, you know, I mean, it's a small field, so we'll cross paths many times over the years, but to think about these kinds of questions as you get more deeply into teaching, because I think the Black Studies classroom, this is something that my collaborator Ashley and I are really interested in, and how the Black Studies classroom is itself different than a disciplinary classroom. I don't know that I have good words for that, but I'm super intrigued by it.
Yeah, I wish during my time I was able to teach in person more Black Studies courses. I got to teach online, so that perhaps that's also like impacted my thinking around it.
Because the Zoom classroom is, oh God.
Yeah, it's been interesting, to put it in one way. But having to teach like introductory English courses in person, that's been also an interesting experience, because I think often, like you mentioned, even though people's ideas around English as a discipline is very like, this is a rigid kind of like almost snobby field, maybe. Like people often think about classics and classic literature as like, you're gonna correct my grammar if you're an English major or something like that. Whereas really English does allow for more creativity than people give it credit for, I think. As you mentioned, like there are a lot of folks in English really pushing the boundaries of the discipline there as well. It's like, yeah, this is English too. So yeah, I don't know.
Well, I have a funny journey because I did my PhD in philosophy, and so when you tell people, you know, I work in the philosophy department, when I used to tell them that, it would be like, oh, let me tell you my philosophy, which is on an airplane, like the last part of the flight I would like to experience. But if I say I'm in an English department, exactly what you said, oh, I better make sure I use good grammar.
Yeah.
I was like, some of us love breaking grammar apart, so go ahead.
Right,
Actually,
exactly.
Well, let me ask you, returning to the field of Black Studies and thinking about, you know, the 5+ decades of its existence, I'm curious how, what you think that the field has done particularly well, like as a field historically, but also what you think it hasn't done very well.
That's a really hard question, obviously. But I think one thing, as I think I mentioned a little bit, is this idea of bringing to the fore like ethics of care, and just like how do we engage with scholarship in a way that's not harmful. I'm thinking about Moya Bailey's, even though she's writing in the context of digital humanities, but even so, it still feels relevant to Black Studies, especially if you engage with Black Studies in a digital way. But thinking about like writing at the speed of trust, or like producing knowledge at the speed of trust, where you know, it's not just, you're not just a machine that's supposed to like push out all these articles, or think about, you know, developments as like, oh, this is really fascinating, let's really unpack that right now. And of course that came at like after the beginning of the COVID pandemic, so that's also kind of coloring the way that ethics of care is coming out. But thinking about that, thinking about Hartman's you know, scenes of subjection and wayward lives, and Venus into Acts, and how her work has also impacted the way we think about how we engage with the archives, and thinking about like I said, the subjects that we study are not just that. They're people with lives and perhaps should be also considered producers of knowledge in ways that we think about like a theorist. And so I think one thing, and I say that, and it's interesting because some of these scholars are not necessarily in Black Studies departments, or
Mhm.
perhaps don't have Black Studies degrees. So that also makes it interesting too, like that relationship, where I think probably now we're going to start seeing more scholars that have proper, or I don't want to say proper, but actual doctorates in Africana or Black Studies, um,
Mhm.
being perhaps part of a Black Studies department, um, than we have had in the past, obviously, because,
Yeah.
just the creation of that department being offered as a PhD is also significant. So I think there's exciting things to come perhaps from that. And I think again, like I mentioned earlier, perhaps it's more of an issue with academia. But sometimes just the field's becoming rigid and what's allowed or what's not allowed. Or even I think about it as far as like diaspora wars or something like that, like how things sometimes get too um subsections, like even as someone that engages with the Caribbean, sometimes it feels like, am I supposed to be in Caribbean studies, am I supposed to be in Black studies, or even Afro-Latino studies, like there's also all of these things, like do I belong in a Latinx department, like there.
Yeah.
And I mean, you can make yourself legible across any of those, but still, even the fact that you have to like modify your CV or
Yep.
your cover letter to relate to each of those fields, perhaps feel like one of the setbacks in the institutionalization of Black studies is this idea of like, this is how you can read me as a Black studies scholar versus, I don't
Yeah.
know, something else.
I mean, part of institutionalization, I mean, I think one of the really positive things about institutionalization is it creates an imaginary, right? So there's the Black
Mm-hmm.
studies imagination, right? The
Right.
imagination of what Black studies is and what it means to be in relation to it. But like every imaginary, it sets, I think in the case of Black studies, really, porous boundaries. But
Mm-hmm.
what you were talking about and thinking about your some of the ways you've talked about your work in the Caribbean. I mean, the place of the Hispanophone Caribbean in the
Mm-hmm.
Black Studies imagination is a completely new horizon, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's one
Exactly.
that gets to like deep resistances that aren't just from the field or the field's development or its complex relationship to Latinx studies, but also to
Right.
identities of Blackness in Cuba,
Right.
Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico, which are their own discourses. But thinking about, one of my colleagues in my previous job at Amherst College, I mean, her work was just really dedicated to this, let's bring Afro-Latinos back into the Black studies imagination as a field.
Right.
And it was just interesting to pause and think, like, how did we get here that's a question?
Right.
That's interesting, but it's really interesting to just see, like, what does it mean to work to expand that sense of the imaginary? Because I don't think the field has been very good. I think you're right, has been very good at being porous with its imaginary. It has a lot to do with, I think, the dominance
Mm-hmm.
of African American intellectual traditions, which are deep and wide and robust like few others in the world, but also the Caribbean. As a Caribbeanist myself, I find this so interesting, when how little the Caribbean can get read sometimes in Black studies context. And I'm like, there's like Nobel Prize winners down here. Come on,
Yeah. And it's like it almost feels stuck in the past in a way, I guess, for lack of
Yeah.
a better phrasing, because we'll read CLR James or talk about the Haitian Revolution, and it almost sometimes stays there. Whereas in all of these places, are still, like you say, producing significant theories, significant, contributions to the fields now, like, and
Yep.
it has developed in fascinating ways.
Well, let me think, getting back to the sort of discipline area studies question, one of the things, this is a very speculative future kind of question. Um, and I think a lot about the origins of Black studies and its twin imperatives and how we reckon with that in the contemporary moment, but also how we imagine, what would the success of Black studies look like in the future? Like, what would it mean to say Black studies has fulfilled its task, right? And so, like, one way of thinking about it goes back to this, origin point of the field, the disciplines hadn't treated Black life in any kind of substantial way. But maybe in the future, the presence of Black studies for a century, say, would so transform the disciplines that Black life is absolutely central to them. Right? I think English departments in some ways are on the cutting edge of that, where I think like the study of Black literature, especially African-American literature, is so central to English departments, especially sort of, Gen X and younger. Faculty members and curricula and everything. So maybe one of the indices of the success of Black studies would be to no longer be needed because we've so changed the disciplines. But then there's this other question. It's like, is Black studies emerging a set of, does it have emerging kinds of methodologies that can't actually ever be absorbed by disciplines, that become something like a discipline? Right now, it's an area study, multidisciplinary study, whatever you want to call it. But, is the success of Black studies really to arrive at a point where we say, this is something that can't be replaced by any disciplines, that actually has developed its own character so deeply that you can't just sort of redistribute back to sociology, to art history, et cetera. So what do you, and if put that way, what do you think is sort of the future of future success marker of the field?
This is I've been thinking
you said
about
you were
this
interested in
question.
Afrofuturism, so there's like
Yes.
institutional Black futurism or something.
Right. I honestly, I think, this is so difficult because the non-institutional part of me is like, we don't need this anymore. But then I don't know. I think I lean towards more of the side of it becoming its own discipline, in a sense of like, I really don't think that's, and especially at the current moment, I'm thinking about like like the CRT, like panic of like, we need to ban Black books, and DEI being a replacement for other things, just other ways to say words that are slurs. But just thinking about, right. But thinking about that, I think there's no way we can ever say, Black studies has done its job, so we don't need it. I think it will, because I guess only that would be possible if like just academia at large, or like I guess in a Octavia Butler kind of way, like all of society switches and changes, and we have a new, then we won't need Black studies anymore. So I think its success, it needs to be in its continued existence and its continued like nurturing. Again, I think as I mentioned, because there are more doctorates in actual Black studies versus like having to do other disciplines and engaging with Black studies through another discipline, I think we'll see a different Black studies maybe in the next 10, 20 years. Hopefully it lasts that long, even longer than that. But yeah, I think
It has to last. It may be one election away from
right.
not existing, so we all need backup plans. But yeah.
Yeah, right. And that's part of why I'm saying, like, I think its success is in its continued existence, and making sure that it doesn't get completely absorbed into like just I don't know, something that is I don't know, something that's unreachable or something like that. I'm not sure.
Yeah, maybe go forward instead of backwards is sort of what we're
Yeah,
arriving at in terms of this question. Well, let
right.
me ask as a final question, another sort of not speculative, but sort of put you at the center of Black studies for a minute, and just ask you, what do you think is the question we should all be asking in the field?
I was thinking about this. I think one question is how let me back up. Let me back up and give myself a little bit of time to think about this. Um, because I've just been like, what question do I really want us to ask? Um, but perhaps how do we become more inclusive of non-traditional scholars, and give them more platforms, for dictating the field or giving direction to the field. Um, I think that's one question that I'm interested in, due to in part of like the kind of objects and kind of histories I'm interested in. Like recently, I got to write a piece about the Gee's Bend quilt makers and their contributions to their community, and so I think the work that they're doing is really important. And so to think about that as one example of how do we include them in a Black Studies department, more so than just let's talk about them, but how do we get them to talk about their history or to contribute to the field in a different way? Yeah, I think that's my question.
I love that, and I won't go on about it because it's a podcast with you, but those quilt makers, it was one of those quilt makers when I was writing my dissertation at University of Memphis, and at the National Civil Rights Museum, went to one of their exhibits, and I talked with the woman who was, she had introduced her quilt, and I talked with her for a while. That is one of the handful of things that completely changed my relationship to intellectual life and shifted me to a commitment to Black studies. I could not agree with you more. When you mentioned that, I kind of teared up. I'm like,
Oh,
that's the stuff that we really need to take very seriously. And what's interesting to me is the origins of the field of Black studies. So many of these people were there were poets who were making their
exactly.
lives as bohemians and had maybe a bachelor's degree, or James Baldwin a high school diploma. And
Right.
so many of the origins of our fields are so different than what in 2024 we think of as the central text of our field. And
Exactly.
I love this as both a return that is a different kind of future. So
Yes, exactly.
well, thank you so much again for making time. This has been a fantastic conversation. Super interesting. It's given me a lot to think about, and I know it's going to be true for everybody who listens in. So thank you again, and it's been really fantastic to have a chance to talk with you.
Thank you. Thank you again for the invitation. I've loved answering these questions and thinking about Black studies on a larger question.
Awesome. Well, have a great rest of your day, and take care.